one of my key takeaways from having chaired this committee on trying to fix Congress is there's no silver bullet to making the institution work better for the American people. I think it's more like silver buckshot, right? There's a whole bunch of stuff that we've got to do to modernize the institution, to get it more focused on the needs of the American people. And again, my philosophy is, if you want things to work differently, do things differently. And our committee's really trying to walk that walk.
This is Office Hours, and I'm your host, Spencer Raskoff. I co-founded Zillow and ran it for a decade. And in early 2020, I co-founded .LA, the preeminent news service covering the tech scene in my hometown of Los Angeles. On this show, you'll hear from founders, CEOs, and thought leaders from around the world with a focus on the innovators in LA. Representative Derek Kilmer is an American businessperson and politician who has held the seat of Washington's 6th Congressional District since 2013. A member of the Democratic Party, he served as a member of the Washington House of Representatives from 2005 to 2007 and the Washington State Senate from 2007 to 2012. He currently serves as the chair for the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress. Kilmer was born and raised in Port Angeles, Washington State. Both his parents were public school teachers. Kilmer earned a BA in Public Affairs from Princeton in 1996, and he began his career as a consultant for McKinsey Company before entering a career in public service. All right. Welcome, Congressman Kilmer, or Derek, a friend of mine and esteemed congressman from my former state of Washington. Welcome to Office Hours, Derek.
It's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Congressman, why don't you just start by giving your career background? When you graduated from Princeton, where did you go next, and how did that eventually take you to the halls of Congress?
Yeah, I grew up in a little logging town here in the state of Washington, and I was in high school right around the time the timber industry sort of took it on the chin. And saw a lot of my friends' parents lose their jobs, a lot of my neighbors lose their jobs, and it really altered the trajectory of my adult life. So went off to Princeton. Literally, my undergraduate thesis was, how do you help timber towns in Washington state? And then went to graduate school at Oxford and looked at mining towns in the UK and timber towns in Washington, basically trying to figure out, how do you help grow sustainable communities? And after grad school, I was deep in college debt. So spent a few years working at McKinsey Company, trying to get some private sector experience and trying to dig out of college debt. And then decided I wanted to actually work in the field that I had studied, which was economic development, and went to go work for a nonprofit focused on economic development, trying to get more jobs here in our area. And never thought I'd run for office. I was just a grumpy economic developer. I kept finding myself saying, gosh, what government does and doesn't do sure impacts our ability to grow jobs. And finally, some of my friends said, you seem to have a lot of good ideas and you sure complain a lot. Why don't you go do something about it, pal? And the next thing I knew, I was serving in the state legislature, first in the state house and then in the state senate. And then in 2012, the guy who'd represented me from the time I was 3 years old announced that he was retiring. And I decided to take the plunge and run for Congress with an eye toward first trying to create more economic opportunity in the district that I represent, and two, just trying to make government work better.
So let's stay on the state politics for a moment before we move to Congress, because a lot of policy and probably a lot more things are affected in people's everyday lives by state legislature decisions than we all realize. So having been in the state house and state senate, give us a little window into how these state governmental bodies function or don't function.
I came from a mostly functional state legislative body, and obviously to your point, state legislatures have a lot of impact on their local communities, everything from the quality of your K-12 schools and how well your teachers get compensated to, what sort of financial aid is available if a kid wants to go to a community college or to a four-year university, looking at areas around environmental protection, economic development policy, which drove me to serve in the legislature. One of the things I appreciated in serving in the Washington State Legislature was that, the pie chart that was legislative time was predominantly focused on just trying to solve problems. And the slice that was dealing with political bull was pretty small when I served in the state legislature. And that was a bit of a shock to my system when I got to Congress, just to see how much time was exhausted on sort of political brinkmanship rather than on actually trying to get pucks into the net for our constituents.
And to what do you attribute that difference between the state and national level?
I think there's a lot of factors at play. Certainly, I think part of it is how people get to Congress. The red districts are far more red and our blue districts are far more blue. Here in the state of Washington, we have a nonpartisan redistricting commission or a bipartisan redistricting commission, which has been very helpful. We also have a top 2 primary in the state of Washington. And so there's not this attempt to appeal to the party base or to the fringe of the parties, but rather to try to find some common ground where you can. And I think that has been fundamentally different in our nation's capital. There's some other things at play too, a body of 49 members, which when I was in the state Senate, I knew everybody that I served with. I knew their spouses' names. I knew many of their kids. That is different in Congress where you have 435 members, and a lot of them you may not know and you don't have that relationship with, and it's a lot easier to declare war against someone you don't know.
I think you also once told me that state elected officials, at least in Washington state, only perform their elected official duties part-time, that they also have...
Yeah, that's right.
They have regular jobs, if you will. And obviously being a congressperson is a full-time job. Does that keep them a little bit more connected and more to the outside world and not ensconced in their political bubble?
I actually do think so. There is a value in having a citizen legislature because you're back in your community. And I always found the interim when we weren't in legislative session to be a valuable time to be out meeting with my constituents, hearing what was on their mind and sort of preparing legislation for the next legislative session because you were hearing from your constituents, you were identifying problems. So it was much, much more of a, the interim was around problem identification and solution development. And then the legislative session was around trying to get it done.
So moving to Washington, D.C., both literally and figuratively, when you became an elected congressperson and moved to D.C., what surprised you most about being in Congress as compared with your expectations?
Probably the biggest surprise to me was just how much time was spent on political bull. I'll give you an example. When I was in the state legislature, and this is part of the work that I'm doing on this committee that I'm sure we'll talk about. When I was in the state legislature, every bill was brought up under what was called an open rule, meaning if you had an amendment that was at all germane to the bill, you could offer it, it would be debated, and it would be voted on. And I can think of in my time in Olympia, maybe 5, maybe 6 times where that was abused, where someone used that as an opportunity to try to score political points rather than actually genuinely wanting to amend a bill and change it. I contrast that with Washington, D.C. And, if you had an open rule, it would be and we don't, it would be primarily focused on just trying to jam the other side, right? And that's not with regard to which party's in the majority or the minority. Both parties are unfortunately equal opportunity offenders on this front. And the problem therein is, that's not about rules, right? That there was no rule in the Washington state legislature that said, hey, don't be a jerk. That's about norms. And so one of the things that I think was most profoundly different when I got to Washington, D.C. was just the culture was very different. The culture was one of conflict, or what Amanda Ripley in her book High Conflict refers to as high conflict, which is conflict sometimes just in the service of the conflict. And I think it has made it much more difficult for the institution to focus on making progress on behalf of the American people, and instead gets too much focused on partisan bickering and point scoring.
So I have lots of questions about this and lots of ideas from the outside around, my naive ideas around how to improve the inner workings of Congress. But let's move to your bipartisan committee on modernizing Congress, or what's the proper title for that? Yeah,
the committee is called the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, which makes us sound a little bit like the IT help desk, but we've been nicknamed the Fix Congress Committee.
Okay.
Usually when I say that, people either chuckle or offer to pray for me. But about every 20 or 30 years or so, Congress realizes things aren't working the way they ought to, and they create a committee to do something about it. This is the most recent iteration of that. The last one was back in 1993. We were set up as a committee with 6 Democrats and 6 Republicans, and with a pretty simple but challenging mission of make Congress work better for the American people. And there were a number of sub-elements of that were assigned to our committee, everything from trying to have Congress be a place that can recruit, retain, and have more diverse staff, that's important to the American people because unfortunately we see massive turnover in the institution. And so when people are only there on average a little over 3 years, that means you see expertise just go out the door. That makes it harder for the institution to solve big problems, not to mention the fact that it makes the institution overly reliant on lobbyists, and that doesn't serve the interests of the American people. We were asked to look at things like technology. Congress has been described as a 18th century institution using 20th century technology to solve 21st century problems. I think that's a pretty apt description, and it's one of the things that our committee has been looking at. We've been asked to look at rules and procedures. We've been asked to look at even things like schedule and calendar, which unfortunately contribute pretty mightily to some of the challenges that we face in Congress. And then we've looked at some things outside of our assignment, including how do you foster civility and collaboration in an institution that's not particularly built for that these days.
Describe for listeners what you told me about freshman orientation for new Congress people and how that creates a partisan rancor right from the start.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I just mentioned that we decided to look at these issues related to civility and collaboration. And in doing so, we talked to a whole lot of experts. We talked to folks with expertise in organizational psychology, management consultants. We talked with marriage counselors, which was really interesting. We talked to sports coaches who had taken over dysfunctional teams and turned it around. And one of the sports coaches I talked to said, what do you do when you've got team members who are actively trying to torpedo your own team? And he said, well, I cut them. I said, well, so we don't have that option. And he said, well, then I bench them. And I said, well, we don't have that option either. And he said, well, let me ask you something. I said, shoot. And he said, how do you do orientation? And I said, well, that's interesting because literally you have members who complain about the fact that when you show up for Congress, they literally have Democrats get on one bus and Republicans get on the other bus. And he said, well, I don't know a whole lot about Congress, but sure seems like you got to stop doing that. Mm-hmm. And so one of our recommendations was stop doing that, right? Actually, let's try to foster collaboration and bipartisanship as part of the orientation process and try to develop some of those relationships so it's not so tribal from the beginning.
Have you been able to execute that recommendation?
We have. And I'll tell you what, some of what we've done on this committee, I don't know if you'd like me to say a few words about it, but we've just decided that if you want Congress to work differently, you have to do things differently. And our committee's doing a number of things very differently that I think folks might find interesting.
Please. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, so let me give you an example. I'll give you a few examples. So one, when you start a new committee, the first thing that happens is you get a budget. And generally, you do very simple math, and Democrats get their half of the money. They use it primarily to hire people with a Democratic background and put on blue jerseys. And Republicans take their half of the money, and they use it to hire people with a Republican background who put on red jerseys. And then they spend the rest of the time fighting with each other. When our committee started, I approached my Republican counterpart and said, hey, I got a crazy idea for you. What if we don't do that? What if we hire a joint team? And some of them will be people with a Democratic background and some with a Republican background. But they'll all put on jerseys that say, hey, let's fix Congress. And to his credit, he said, sure, I'm game. Let's give it a try. So we've done that. And it's really helped foster collaboration in a way that you don't see on most committees. If you watch one of our hearings on C-SPAN, you probably have too much time on your hands. But if you watch one of our hearings on C-SPAN, you'll notice a few things. One, we don't sit with Democrats on one side of a dais and Republicans on the other. We stagger our seating so that when you're in a hearing and you hear something interesting, my genetic predisposition is to lean over to the person next to me and say, that's kind of interesting. What do you think about that? And in our committee, you're leaning over to someone from a different party.
And every other committee hearing or committee meeting is
every other committee does separates the group.
And where is that by rule or that's just by tradition? I mean, if another committee chair wanted to follow what you've done in your committee, could they do that?
They could. And in fact, one of our recommendations has been other committees should experiment with this type of thing. You'll notice if you watch one of our hearings, we don't even sit on a dais. We sit around a round table. Why do we do that? Well, I don't know about you. I've never had a good conversation speaking to the back of somebody's head. Mm-hmm. And so being able to look one another in the eye and actually engage one another, again, if you watch most committees, again, just as an example, most committees limit you to 5 minutes. What generally happens in those committees is members, because they're usually in 3 or 4 committees at the same time, don't show up until it's their time to ask a question. They usually don't use the 5 minutes to ask a question. They use it to predominantly make a statement that they can then stick up on social media. Mm-hmm. And the problem with that is if Congress is going to be able to solve difficult problems. Most of that problem solving is supposed to happen in committees, which means one, you have to be there, and two, you have to be able to pull on threads and learn something. So in our committee, we haven't limited members to 5 minutes. We said, if you've got a question or if you hear something, and we don't even go questions by seniority. We say, if someone says something and you want to pull on that thread, just say, hey, I want to pull on that thread. And we let people do that. And I will tell you, in allowing that, I have not seen anybody on our committee abuse it. Not the most conservative Republican, not the most progressive Democrat. People have used it as an opportunity to learn and to form solutions. And as a consequence, our committee, if you look at the history of these select committees, it's not a terrific story of success, right? Historically, if you look at there was a select committee a few years ago on budget and appropriations process reform. It passed 0 recommendations. Before that, there was the super committee on debt and deficit reduction. 0 recommendations. You can go all the way back to the 90s, and they've all kind of struck out. Our committee has now passed over 140 bipartisan recommendations.
And which of those recommendations have been instituted?
About 2/3 have either been implemented or are on the pathway to implementation.
Wow. So walk us through a couple of the ones that you're most proud of that have been implemented.
Well, there's a few. We made a number of recommendations related to staffing, because the institution depends on competent people with expertise staying in the institution. And so we've made a number of recommendations just focused on trying to enable the institution to better recruit and retain staff. We've also looked at some really tricky issues, some difficult issues. So, for example, we had an entire set of hearings related to the Congress's Article 1 responsibilities under the Constitution. And one of the Article 1 responsibilities is the power of the purse, which for many years Congress has largely sort of given up to the executive branch. We proposed what we call community project funding, which is a more sort of transparent and accountable way of members of Congress being able to dedicate funding toward projects in their districts. That is something that had not existed for the previous more than a decade, that had existed previously in a way that was abused. And we proposed a series of reforms that have now been implemented. And as a consequence, you're seeing, one, more consistency with what the Constitution intended. The Constitution intended for members who know their districts best to make decisions about the needs of their district. But two, I just think about in my neck of the woods, I'm sitting in Aberdeen, Washington, where 90% of the property's in the floodplain. One of the community projects that I just secured funding for was to help pull some of the properties out of the floodplain and help this community develop its local economy and develop some affordable housing. Those are the types of things that you can do when you empower members. We've made some recommendations. I mentioned we looked at issues related to civility and collaboration. So one of the recommendations that we've been pushing has been related to schedule and calendar. One of the problems in Congress is we're not there enough. If you look at pre-pandemic 2019, the House was in session 65 full days and 66 travel days. The average member sits on 5.4 committees and subcommittees, all of which meet on those full days, which is why, if you watch C-SPAN, it looks like no one's ever at their committee meetings. It's not that they're not doing their job. It's that they're in 3 or 4 committees at the same time. So one of our recommendations was, one, Congress should be in session at least more full days than travel days. And two, every high school and college in the country has figured out how to deconflict schedule. Congress ought to do that too, so that members, if they're in an appropriations hearing, can be in the appropriations hearing and not be in 3 other hearings at the same time. So that's one of the things that that's in the process of implementation, and I think could be a real game changer.
That's amazing. And these are things obviously that citizens have no visibility to and, never think about, but it clearly contributes to how well functioning or not well functioning government is. 2 big ones that I've always wondered about. One is the role of media and media coverage and how that contributes to the polarization and lack of bipartisanship. And if there are any recommendations that you made around trying to mitigate that. And the second is a much harder one to solve because, for better or for worse, it's in the Constitution, but that's the 2-year term for Congress people. Could you talk about how those 2 issues impact the functioning of the Congress?
I think the combination of media and social media do make things more challenging, in part because the incentive is to say inflammatory things that get you on cable news or that go viral on social media. And that that makes it difficult, right? I always like to say that the boat moves, the seas are really rocky. We have a lot of complicated issues, and the boat moves best when all the oars are in the water rowing in the same direction. I used to say it's a problem because half the oars are rowing in one direction and half the oars are rowing in the other. That's not even true, because it's more like 45% of the oars are rowing in one direction, 45% in the other, and about 10% of the people in the boat have their oars out of the water, just actively beating the heck out of everybody else in the boat with their oars, right? That's a problem. And that's a problem that is unfortunately amplified and exacerbated by social media and cable news.
Yeah.
That's tricky in terms of what you can do about it. Having said that, in the area of civility and collaboration, our committee has made more than a dozen recommendations, just trying to make some targeted strategic interventions to change up the incentives a little bit, right? So, for example, I'll give you a few examples. One, when you sponsor a bill, oftentimes it may become law, but it may not become law as your bill. It may be part of some omnibus spending package, or it may get looped into some other bill broadly on the topic, right? You may have a veteran affairs bill dealing with veterans homelessness, and it may get put into just a big veterans bill, as an example. Right now, there's not a good way to point to the fact, hey, my bill just became law. So one of our recommendations was through congress.gov, through the Congressional Research Service, actually making sure that members are getting credit for what they're getting done, so that it makes you more likely to want to work with your colleagues, even if it means your name is not the one at the top of the bill to get something across the finish line. One of the things that we have recommended as well is, for lack of a better phrase, sort of a congressional dating service, where if you come to Congress with a desire to work on immigration policy or on debt and deficit reduction or on workforce development, chances are there's a couple dozen other people who are in Congress who want to work on those issues too. But in a body of 435, it's almost impossible to find them. I think about when I was at McKinsey, there was, basically the ability to go onto a firm intranet and say, hey, who's got expertise on this issue? And just find them and get connected to them. That does not exist in Congress. And one of our recommendations was make that exist, so that if you want to actually partner, there's this presumption that we're going to fight like cats and dogs on everything. Listen, there are things we're going to fight like cats and dogs about. And no one is suggesting that you should, when you show up in Congress, sort of set your deeply held beliefs at the door. But you got to at least be able to move forward on some of the things on which there is agreement. And so just trying to facilitate that with some, again, sort of strategic interventions is something that our committee is focused on.
Just focusing on media and social media for a moment, one of the hallmarks of a well-functioning Congress is the transparency and the important role of transparency that media provides.
Sure.
But there are certain committees that meet in secret. The Supreme Court, for example, also doesn't, they allow audio, but they don't put cameras in the courtroom. And that's one way to reduce the bringing of politics into the Supreme Court, although, of course, that's at risk, more and more with every passing session. But are there any ideas in this regard that you think can tamp down on partisanship that is created by the role of media?
Yeah. Well, so it's interesting because there's a fair amount of research in organizational psychology about just even the use of space. So right now, there is no place in the House where Democrats and Republicans, if they want to engage one another on an issue, where they can do that.
Fascinating. It's amazing.
There's not, certainly not without the C-SPAN camera on them or without the media being able to observe it. So one of our recommendations as a committee was create some space, literally physical space, for Democrats and Republicans to engage one another. Interestingly enough, that does exist in the Senate. There is space, even just right off the Senate floor, outside of the view of C-SPAN cameras, outside of the view of the press corps, for members to actually be able to engage each other. That does not exist in the House, but we've recommended that it should. We've even recommended that for staff, so that one of our recommendations was create some bipartisan kind of co-working space. So that nobody has a home field advantage when you're trying to work on an issue together, and so that you might be able to just sort of facilitate some of the dialogue that's sorely missing in our Congress right now.
If Congress had 4-year terms instead of 2-year terms, would that reduce the reliance on constant fundraising and the role of lobbyists and help some of these issues? I know that's a heavy lift trying to change.
I think it's unlikely we'll make a recommendation in that regard. I mean, certainly the fact that so much of the time is sort of political season for, not for everybody, but for a good chunk of Congress gets kind of consumed by the political season. I think that is a problem that doesn't help get stuff done for the American people. Having said that, if I were looking at some of the main drivers of dysfunction in the institution, I would actually, and we're going to actually have a hearing in June called Pathways to Leadership. And it's really looking at how do members get to Congress. That may elevate some issues like partisan gerrymandering and even things like the top two primary. I come from a state that the top two vote getters, regardless of party, move on to the general election. And so even where you have in Eastern Washington a deep red district, you have a very pragmatic Republican who was actually part of the cabinet of our former Democratic governor serving in that very red district because of the top two primary. And because when there were two Republicans on the ballot in the general election, every Democrat said, well, that guy seems pretty good. We'll try to choose the person who's most pragmatic and most willing to work across the aisle.
If you could wave a magic wand and change one thing about how Congress operates, what would it be?
I think there's too much money in our political system. I think looking at profound campaign finance reform would be significant. And it would mean that members, particularly those members who are from very, very swing districts, wouldn't have to spend so much time consumed with fundraising and could focus on their jobs. I think that could also reduce the role of special interests in our political system. Having said that, one of my key takeaways from having chaired this committee on trying to fix Congress is there's no silver bullet to making the institution work better for the American people. I think it's more like silver buckshot, right? There's a whole bunch of stuff that we've got to do to modernize the institution, to get it more focused on the needs of the American people. And again, my philosophy is, if you want things to work differently, do things differently. And our committee's really trying to walk that walk.
When you look at the Senate and contrast it with the way the House operates, explain to listeners how these two institutions are similar, how they're different, and what can the House that you're trying to reform learn from the Senate or vice versa?
Well, the paramount difference is in the House, there's majority rule. And in the Senate, because of the filibuster, it really takes a supermajority to get anything done. And that, I think, is challenging, right? We've gotten so much legislation through the House that's sadly been sort of stuck in the parking lot in the United States Senate. I've got some views on that. But
for folks that aren't in the day-to-day, the filibuster allows for or requires 60 votes in the Senate to move legislation forward. And so that supermajority makes it difficult. So even though the Dems control the Senate nominally, kind of barely, they can't really get anything passed because they don't have enough votes to get over the filibuster. So would you recommend removing the filibuster in the Senate? I know that's not something in your purview. That's up to the Senate to create their own rules. But what are the pros and cons of the filibuster, and what is your position on it?
I mean, to me, the biggest con is if you're against a bill, vote against it. But the filibuster basically enables you to prevent a bill from even being brought forward for a vote because you can't move on from debate. And that doesn't seem in keeping with the vision of the founders, right? Our founders didn't say make it impossible to move something forward. I get that there are folks who sort of protect that tradition with the belief that somehow it engenders more bipartisanship and collaboration. My view of the modern United States Senate is that's not really true. We haven't seen a lot of that. So while that's outside the purview of our committee, I do think that the presence of the filibuster, part of the reason, it's weird. I'm part of an organization in Congress that, according to recent polling, is less popular than head lice, colonoscopies, and the rock band Nickelback. And, you have a sense of why that's the case. But one of the main reasons that's the case is I think the American people are genuinely frustrated when Congress can't even seem to move forward on the issues on which there is agreement.
Mm-hmm. Was the filibuster, a little history lesson here, the filibuster was introduced somewhere along the way. This was not something that the founders created. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah. And it was primarily an artifact of trying to prevent people who didn't have rights from gaining rights.
Right, right.
And I don't think that's a tradition worth protecting.
But careful what you wish for. If the filibuster were removed and Republicans controlled the Senate and the House, are you prepared to live with whatever that might result in?
Well, that's always the argument, right? But that's what we do live with in the House, right? When things, it turns out elections have consequences. And my general belief is if the American public wants the country to move in one direction, it will support the party that's trying to drive things in that direction. And if they don't, they won't.
Last topic. Let's talk about climate change, and which is an issue I know is very important to you and to me and to many of our listeners. And maybe we use that as a little bit of a case study to discuss through the lens of all the ways that you're trying to improve the functioning of the House. How can we end up with real climate action, given all of the challenges that we've been discussing around partisanship and the role of media and social media and the filibuster in the Senate? Where do we stand on climate action?
In dire need of it. I represent a district that, is seeing the impacts of climate change in real time. I represent the west coast of Washington State, the Olympic Peninsula. There are 4 coastal tribes. I represent 12 Native American tribes. 4 are coastal tribes that, while you and I are here on this Zoom together, they're in the process of trying to move to the ground because they're getting washed off the planet. I had one of the tribal leaders say, when I was a kid, the ocean was a football field's length away. And now it's our front porch. And the lower village of her tribe is below sea level. And so when their seawall breaches, it fills up like a bowl. Their village fills up like a bowl. And it's just heartbreaking. And so they're feeling it. I got 3,200 people in the district I represent whose livelihoods are tied to our fisheries and shellfish growing. Changing ocean chemistry is impacting their ability to make a living. I've lived here other than going away for college and graduate school. I've lived here all my life. I start every day by checking the weather app on my phone. Up until recent years, I never remember the weather forecast being for smoke.
Right.
And we've seen such dramatic wildfires that has literally been our forecast on many days in the summer. I think my governor put it really well when he said, we're the first generation to see the impacts of climate change and the last generation that can do something about it. The good news is there is actually some bipartisan progress on these issues. There are some areas where we can make progress on climate action, where you can get Democrats and Republicans to agree. Even in the infrastructure bill, which was a really important and big bill, you saw historic investments in trying to build out our electric vehicle charging infrastructure so that if we're going to remove emissions from tailpipes, we need to move in that direction of more fuel efficient and no emission vehicles. That only works if you have the infrastructure to support it. That was a bipartisan bill, more bipartisan in the Senate than in the House. But, that I think should give folks some hope. You've generally seen some support for tax policy that tries to drive more investment in renewables. And this administration is trying to get more aggressive about that. We need to get more aggressive about that and drive more innovation in that space. But I don't think we have time to waste. And one of the areas that's been helpful is both when the business community has spoken up on these issues and when the defense community has spoken up on this. The Department of Defense has identified climate change as a threat multiplier. The largest employer in my district is the Navy. Turns out most of our Navy bases are on the water, and they're getting, they're dealing with some of the resiliency issues caused by climate change. And so I do think that as you see the business community speak up, as you see the military, the Defense Department speak up, you're starting to drive more people, not everybody. I mean, listen, when I got to Congress, I was on the Science Committee, and we literally had a hearing on the myth of climate change in the Science Committee, which was horrifying. But you are seeing, I think, at least some appreciation by at least some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle that we got to do something about this, and we don't have time to waste.
Well, Congressman Kilmer, I think we can agree, whether listeners are Republican or Democrat, I admire what you're trying to do, what the Bipartisan Committee is trying to do to improve civility, to improve the well-functioning nature of Congress. And there are a lot of parallels to those of us in the private sector that try to unite companies behind a common mission and try to help people recognize that if they work well together, they can accomplish great things, even though they might disagree about a lot of details. So thank you for the work that you do. Good luck. And I've enjoyed the conversation very, very much. It's always great to see you.
Thanks so much, Spencer.
That's it for this episode of Office Hours. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm your host, Spencer Raskoff. If you could leave a rating or review for the podcast, I'd greatly appreciate it. And always feel free to tweet at me on Twitter. That's at Spencer Raskoff. This episode was edited by George Macharko of The Podcast Editor. You can hear more Office Hours by subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Spencer Raskoff, all one word. See you next time, and thanks for listening.